Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So, let's just begin. Welcome members to the 21st meeting of the 2019 Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. We'll be moving straight into business with agenda item 1 on the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. Now, joining us today, I'm very pleased to say that we've got Dame Sue Bruce, we've got Andy O'Neill, and we've got Bob Posner from the Electoral Commission. Now, what we won't be doing, because we're a wee bit limited for time because we've got 2 panels today, we won't be having opening speeches. So what I was thinking was, if I could just ask you a couple of wee questions joined, you could maybe just lead into from there, if that seems reasonable. So the bill proposes changing the lines of accountability for the Electoral Commission so that it's accountable to the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body for Scottish elections. Now, could you explain from that the impact of the changes being proposed to the accountability of the Electoral Commission and who you report to? And do you have any concerns with the proposed changes to accountability and the new reporting arrangements at all? Anyone at all?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to give evidence. Can I just at the outset say that we very much welcome this bill and welcome the opportunity to see formal mechanisms established for the Electoral Commission to be accountable directly to the Scottish Parliament. We think it's important that the Electoral Commission in its interactions with any of the Scottish elections should have that formal link directly into the Parliament for accountability. So there are discussions ongoing. Bob, you can maybe go on the...
Yes, of course. So as a body from when we were first formed back in 2000, we've always striven to be accountable to this Parliament, appearing before select committees on policy issues and so forth. But this is a big change because this is the financial flow of money in relation to Scottish elections. As he says, we very much welcome that. We've very much been working hard towards that. We've been in discussions with parliamentary officials, with government officials to make that work and work well. So those discussions are in an advanced stage to get the formula and the approach right. For us as a body, we will be diligent in making sure that the work we do in Scotland on Scottish elections is directly accountable, that the money is transparent, that we're properly audited, that there's proper scrutiny and oversight. That will be our approach. And in terms of the commissioners, the Commission Board, I know they and I as the Commission Counting Officer, we're absolutely clear that we proceed that way.
Okay, great. Are there any pardon me, are there any concerns at all about moving from the system as pertains to the new one at all, or should it be smooth? Or?
I think it will be smooth. I think one of the key things is that, because clearly, as you'll be aware, in the Welsh Assembly also we're moving to direct accountability there on financial matters, is there will be effectively 3 parliaments which we're facing. We will have, as all public bodies, we'll have an annual business and corporate, and we'll have a 5-year rolling corporate plan and so forth. So we will need to make sure that our plans reflect the needs and the priorities of the 3 legislatures and reflect that. So if I have a concern, but it's not a negative concern, it's a positive one, that works well, it will require us to be alert to that. And I think it will require the sort of officials and procedures in all 3 parliaments to interact well, but for that to be efficient.
Yeah, well,
we just add on what Bob's saying. I mean, obviously the complications in the sense of we're now going to deal with 3 legislatures, but we've been working with Scottish Parliament officials and Scottish Government officials for a number of years now to try and work out how this actually works in reality when it commences. So, I mean, I'm aware of the fact that the corporate bodies has got some comments around auditing and finance formula and such, and we're working with others to try and sort those things out, because in a sense it's for yourselves as the Parliament and the Senate and the Speakers Committee of the House of Commons to actually agree the funding formula. We're acting as expert advisors because obviously we know what we do because we do it. But so we're kind of getting to that point. I think one of the things we would be very keen on ensuring is that the provisions in this bill are commenced as soon as possible after the parliamentary process takes place, because Obviously, the corporate body would want our estimate submission to be with them round about September-ish next year for the next financial year. And that's quite an important year for yourselves, of course, because it's a year in which a Scottish Parliament takes place, and we do lots of things around the Scottish Parliament. So if the one thing I could say to you is, if we can get commencement quite early, that would really help us.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, that seems to make a lot of sense to me. No one else wants to come in at that point at the moment. So we have got a couple of questions from Mark Ruskell, please.
Yeah, morning everybody. Just referring back to your written evidence, you're saying that the bill includes some elements that will improve the reporting of spending at local council elections, but you understand the Minister will make other changes using his powers under secondary legislation, and then you go on to say that the bill does not present a full picture of these changes. Are you saying it's really unclear where the balance of primary and secondary legislation will be? Are you sort of clear on what the changes will be, or do you think there needs to be greater clarity at this point?
So the context there is on the this bill introduces, if I sort of take a specific point, this bill introduces donation controls in the candidate regime for your Scottish local elections, and that's a good thing. That brings those elections modernised and in line, you know, with wider your other elections and other elections in the UK. It's moving towards doing the same on the spending controls for candidates. But what we're saying is there's more to be done there. Whether that's done subsequently through secondary legislation or it requires primary, I think there are choices. I think quite a lot can be done through secondary legislation. Okay. But what we're saying on the bill, there's more to need to be done there, and I think you presumably want that.
Would it make sense to put it into primary legislation then?
Well, I think what we see is the whole regulation, particularly of the council elections, it's a package, and some of it's in this bill, some of it's in the franchise bill, which you're also looking at, and some of it will be in secondary legislation. Now, some of that secondary legislation will come in the what we call the local government elections order. That will likely come in 2021 for the 2022 elections. For instance, some of the things we've been making recommendations, which we see in our written evidence since the 2012 local government elections. So, for instance, this bill creates donation controls for council elections, because currently a candidate has to give in the return what you've spent your money on, but you don't have to say where your money came from, which is, when you compare it to England, Wales and Northern Ireland's elections, different. It's deficient. So it's bringing it up to that kind of the standard, as it were. The statement of expenses form is in this bill. But there are other things, for instance, like at the moment, when as you'll all know, we provide candidate and party guidance for elections. The candidate guidance in council elections isn't of the same status as all the other election guidance. If you follow our guidance in the Scottish Parliament elections and you do something wrong, it's a defence to say you followed our guidance. That doesn't exist in the council elections because we've done it since 2003, but we haven't done it on a statutory basis. We've done it as an agent with an agreement with Scottish Government, or Scottish Executive initially. So that will change, but that will change via secondary legislation. All of these things we understand with Scottish Government will be in place for the 2022 elections, but some of it's now and some of it's later. And I suppose the only thing I would say is, obviously, the Scottish Government's committed to doing this, and we would hope that they do.
Okay. So that is the full picture then that you've described, and are you content with that?
Yeah. The answer is yes.
Right.
But I would say this as Chief Executive of the Electoral Commission. And for the Commission Board. If you think, we welcome this bill, as Sue said, because it's going in the right direction, it's modernising and reforming. But if you step back from that and you look at the wider picture on our electoral law, there is, I think, a broad consensus. It needs modernising, consolidating. There's a lot to be done, and as you'll know, your Scottish Law Commission worked on that with the other law commissions in the UK a few years ago. There is a really excellent report, a blueprint report they've published, which runs, I think it's quite a long document, but it runs to how electoral law can be modernised across the UK. So we would commend, and we are commending to Scottish Government, we commend to you as a Parliament, that is kept in mind. But one doesn't think this is the end of the journey. I'm sure you're not. When you do this, there's a lot to be done to electoral law. And when one talks about the spending, the donation controls, just take an example of that. and one steps back from that, it is really about transparency for voters and confidence and legitimacy in the system. So there are inconsistencies across. There's currently a general election in the UK. The rules there require pre-poll, us to publish pre-poll reports on donations into the general election on a weekly basis, which is happening now in the lead-up. Now, you might consider in time for Scottish parliamentary elections, that's a good thing, and you might want to introduce that, to take an example. Across the UK, when one looks at spending returns of parties and campaigners, there's a considerable time period after elections before we, the public, the citizens, see what was spent. For many, many months afterwards, before those returns have to come in. Well, in today's digital world, there might be a view those periods could be shortened and those spending returns could be published sooner by political parties and campaigners. That would in everyone's interest. So there's plenty that can be done further, just to give you some examples.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. Thank you for the replies there. Very helpful. Could we move on to Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, please?
In your written evidence, you suggest that the current code of conduct for observers for local government elections should also be used for Scottish Parliament elections. Would the bill, as drafted, not allow for this?
The bill as drafted creates a code for observers for Scottish Parliament elections. Currently, we have a code of observers for all elections across the UK, apart from Scottish Council elections, which is created in the 2011 Local Electoral Administration Scotland Act. But they're exactly the same. And obviously, another committee is looking at the referendum bill. This bill and the referendum bill currently has provisions to require us to produce another code, which would be, we would have to consult on it, give it to ministers, have it laid in the Parliament. It would be likely exactly the same as the Council Code. And what we suggested to the Finance and Constitution Committee is that they should bring, for referendum purposes, the Council Code, suitably amended, obviously, if it needs to be, or expanded, to cover that. We would say for Scottish Parliament elections, it should be the same code. So there would be one code for Scottish electoral events, and then we would have the other code for everywhere else across the UK. Otherwise, it would get quite confusing for observers, because you appoint an observer for 3 years, and we would have to give, on a technical basis, you'd have to give them 2 different badges, and they would have to remember which badge they had to wear at certain events, and it just seems unnecessary duplication.
So that consistency,
it's about consistency.
You feel is advantageous.
Yeah. And could I say, the amendments have just come out for the referendum bill. There is amendment doing that for Scottish referendums under the referendum, which would become an act. So, in another place.
So sorry, with the referendum bill, that
it
would be the same.
It would be the council code for the referendums as well. We change its name presumably to Scottish Electoral Events Code.
Okay.
Like that.
And you I won't get you to comment on the referendums, but if you had been looking to create a new code, or you'd need to go through a consultation period, how long would that have taken? Would that have been?
From memory, when we brought it in after 20, it takes. I mean, you publicly consult, and then you go to minister, and then it gets laid. It's a number. I mean, you're talking about 9 months, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. And just on that, do you have any concerns around the timescales for preparing a code of conduct for the Scottish Parliament, candidates?
A code on spending. I think our concern is around being able to deliver it so it is in place well before the Scottish Parliament elections on 6 May 2021. We always talk about the 6-month rule, the Gould principle, that sort of thing. People think that's 6 months before the electoral event, but to a candidate and a party, they need to know well before, because you obviously have to plan. Yeah. We would argue in this instance it will be 6 months before the beginning of the regulated period, which is the first week in the January before the May electoral event. There's 2 aspects in terms of timing. Currently we have the ability to produce a party code. We don't have the ability to produce a candidate code, which this bill gives us. So we need, and in a sense, there's no point doing one without the other. We need the provisions here to be commenced as soon as possible so we can then do the code. But the code is also dependent on what's known as the Scottish Parliament Elections Order, because it will reference back different references into the code from the order. That has to be laid, because it is planned to be revised before the 21 election. It needs to be laid pretty soon so we can then get the right references literally into the code on spending, and then give it to ministers to put it into the Parliament.
Can I ask, and I was just checking that none of my colleagues are going to cover it, but what kind of support do you envisage having to give to those covered by the code in terms of advice once it's there and in place?
What we tend to do is we always try to achieve compliance through guidance, and that's not just beyond producing kind of tomes of guidance, which you can all see on our website, but we offer an advice service. We go to party events and we do drop-in sessions, that sort of stuff. So there's kind of whole thing about it, and you've got to do it well before. That's the key. So,
and does that tend to be quite well engaged with?
Yeah, I mean, some parties do it themselves using our stuff, and they have skilled trainers in it. Others rely on us to do it for them. Of course, there's lots of people stand as independents who come to all of this pretty fresh, particularly when you're talking about council elections, because it's kind of entry level in that sense of formal democracy, and they probably need support. I mean, it's fair to say the smaller parties probably need more support than the major parties who have other people in their professional staff who will give them advice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Thanks, Jamie. And Neil Finlay, please.
Yeah, we've been discussing the list order effect, and I wonder if you could maybe tell us about the research that's been done from your organisation on that.
I mean, this, as you all know, has been floating around for a number of years now, I suppose. I mean, the issue, in a sense, is... sorry, I've got my notes in the wrong way. I mean, the issue is, if you take, for instance, the 2017 local government elections, there were 81% of the wards, the multi-member wards, so that's 284 wards, had more than one candidate from the same party standing in that ward. When that occurs, 73%, we looked at the stats, 73% of those instances, the candidate who was higher up the alphabet for that party received the first preference. So if Sue and I were standing for whatever party, I'm obviously a better candidate than she is, but I get the second preference because she's Bruce and I'm O'Neill. Now, that is the perception. Whether or not it's true, we actually still don't know, because it's very difficult, almost impossible to prove that. But if you look at the preferential orders, which you can do because it's electronically counted, so you got 82% of Labour votes would be AB, 78 SNP, 68 Conservative, 64 Lib Dem. You can't say for certain, of course, that the reason why they voted for Sue first and me second is because she's Bruce and I'm O'Neill. There's millions of other reasons why people vote for people. So there is certainly a perception, and I think probably is some validity in it, lots of validity in it, but there's other reasons why people worry about it. So people have thought about alternatives to alphabetic discrimination, as it gets called. Scottish Government indicated they wanted to review this. Our view in the 27 report on council elections was, whatever you do, you should test it, and we would do the testing for you, to ensure that there isn't any kind of unintended consequences where you finish up, you do something there and something bad happens elsewhere. So anyway, Scottish Government asked us to assess the impact on voters in April this year. They asked us to look at essentially the status quo, order by lot, which is literally you get closing nominations, you get take balls out or whatever you do, and you order it. So you might get alphabetic, you might get it all over the place, or A to Z, Z to A, whereas you would have it alphabetic for one and reversed in the other. So what we did was we employed Ipsos Mori to do some research with the public across Scotland. We also had met with, to ensure that we got the views of voters. We talked to returning officers and deputy returning officers in terms of the administrative impact of all of this. We talked to the political parties in terms of was there anything in terms of campaigning where we needed to be aware of. We also talked to representatives of groups for people with disabilities to ensure that there was no problem there. We published a report which is in Space in September of this year, which I no doubt many of you will have read. Essentially what we found was, and this is qualitative, not quantitative research, I should say, the ordering of candidates didn't have an impact on the voters' ability to find the vote for their preferred candidate. In fact, one of the interesting things in the in-depth interviews we did is quite many of those interviewed weren't aware that the ballot paper was alphabetic before we told them it was alphabetic. We talked to representatives of disability organisations. They are, I think it's fair to say, are very concerned that the changes might mean disabled people would not be able to familiarise themselves with the ballot paper before they came to the polling place or station. And quite often we're told they learn the order so they know what they're going to vote for before they turn up. And of course, A to Z, Z to A means you don't know what you would be facing. You'd have to learn too, in effect. Administrators were confident that they could administer the process, but what they wanted was, and we say this in the report, prescribed rules, because there is issues about transparency, particularly if you went down the road of lot. It would probably mean you'd have to extend the election timetable, because in places where you've got 21 wards and that, we got down to the level of thinking, how long would it take to do the pulling of lots? And administrators thought about 15 per ward. If you've got 20 wards, do the maths, it takes a long time. The parties, there was no consensus across the parties. We met party officials. SNP party officials were very keen on A to Z, Z to A. Lib Dems supported that to a degree. Conservatives were for the status quo, and the Labour Party and the Scottish Greens didn't really have a view. To be fair, the Greens tend not to stand more than one candidate in most places, so it doesn't really impact on them. We gave the report to Scottish Government, and it is really down to Scottish Government to propose something, and that we would expect that, because the ballot paper is a form attached to the elections order. That would come sometime in 2021, before the 22 election. I mean, I'm happy to try and answer any questions or write to anyone afterwards on the subject.
On that, do you know how many people that did you say it was Mori who did the...
Ipsos Mori, yeah.
How many people did they contact?
It's qualitative research, so there was about 112 in-depth interviews taking place all over Scotland, and met disability groups and people with learning disabilities and such like.
So if people didn't know it was alphabetical, but the results were that, what was the percentage you said, 70%?
It was 73% vote alpha, beta, C.
Then presume that to me reinforces the list order effect.
Yeah, I mean,
because people are just simply, if they're unaware it's alphabetical, what they're doing is they're voting for the first person they see.
Yeah, I mean, we did some of the interviews were conducted with glasses which essentially follow the eye, and you record it. And what we found was, and this research is on the website as well, you tend to find a voter some will start at the bottom, but the majority will start at the top, and they'll go down and they'll find the logo, the party emblem first, and then they'll move in and look at the party name, and then they will look for the candidate if they know the candidates and that. And this, of course, is only happening in council elections. So, I mean, you're getting into, I mean, in a sense, the solution is get yourself well known. and popular, and they will look at the name as well. But you know, in council elections, sometimes candidates aren't as well known as perhaps parliamentary candidates.
No, the solution to me would be full randomisation, because then, if you are that popular, well-known person, they'll find you anyway. So, in order to combat that effect that you have basically verified, then we need, I think, we need full randomisation.
We weren't asked to look at that. We were asked by Scottish Government to look at two options, lot and A to Z, Z to A. But I do know administrators would, whilst it's probably not a showstopper, administrators would find full randomisation more challenging in terms of getting the ballot paper in a way and checking it and all the rest of it, because it would just become more administrative.
It would be
you
more
used to administer them. I don't know if you want to comment.
It would be more administrative for the people counting.
Yeah.
That would be the issue, I would think, rather than...
There would be counting as well, but printing issues and checking and correspondence, and all the kind of bureaucracy around an election which people don't really know about, fortunately.
Okay, can we have a wee follow-up on that from Gil Patterson, please?
If I could, convener, was there any evidence taken as to the worth of a candidate? In other words, do people look at the party and give the worth to the party, or was there any account taken about how many votes that an individual, no matter how popular they are, how many votes they actually attract?
Not in this bit of research, no. I mean, it will really come down to how popular the candidates are. I mean, you do get instances, for instance, in the Western Isles, the SNP stood in 2 of the multi-member wards, 2 councillors twice. In those 2 instances, the SNP candidate who is lower down the ballot paper gets elected massively, and the other one doesn't. Now that will go down to being known, but you're talking about a different type of community. I mean, a lot of this is happening in probably what you describe as the Central Belt. So, you know, it does vary around the country, but, you know, yes, you're right. I mean, if you're well kent, they'll find you.
Yeah, but I would, if the notion is that there is no effect on it, you would need to know how many people actually vote for the party. The randomisation may be confusing. I wonder if you agree with maybe someone...
the research was looking at how they voted. It's not the we didn't look at the motivations behind why they voted. I mean, some people were asked to find a specific candidate, and we timed it and such. But you know, the reason why we can't sit here and say it definitely exists as a phenomena is because we just don't know the motivations of an elector when they're in the polling booth voting. There's just so many different motivations.
Yeah, but to come to a conclusion, that's exactly what we would need to know. There's a general opinion within politics that there's a weight given to a candidate, no matter how popular they are. Yeah. And it's a relatively small figure compared to people who vote for a party. So the alphabetical order in the first place, I think, I wonder if you agree with me, would be in relation to the party. People vote on parties now, yeah, and not individuals. So the first part of the exercise would be going to the party, and if you find that, you've won the board game because you found the party.
Because in a sense, I mean, we do hear anecdotal stories of people choosing candidates because they're Bruce rather than O'Neill, so they're higher up the ballot paper and such like. But if you accept 73% on average where there's 2 candidates standing, 73% of the voter votes for Bruce first rather than O'Neill, you're essentially, if you accept that, what they do is start at the top and go down, find the logo, they find the party logo of whatever the one they want and move in. They're going to allocate the first preference to that party representative. So in that sense, 73% of them are accepting the party ticket and not choosing the difference between the 2 human beings, as it were.
Well, I wonder if you agree with me with the evidence that you presented at the start of your presentation proves that very point. That in every instance when it came to the party, there was no, you didn't present any evidence that reversed that. that in every case, when it came to alphabetical order, then it's exactly what
I
you've
think
described.
you can accept that. I mean, I personally accept that there is likely to be an alphabetic discrimination in the process, but you can't say that for certain because you don't know all the other motivations of the voter. They may well be voting for Bruce rather than O'Neill because, frankly, they know Bruce and she's a far better candidate than I am. Yeah, so you don't know, but I think it is likely. I think the solutions might lessen the effect, but we don't know because you could. I mean, for instance, if you chose A to Z, Z to A, you have someone comes in and votes for a particular party. They will vote alpha, beta. You'd have to ensure that your next candidate for the same party got a different ballot paper, and you don't know that because they would likely be A to Z, Z to A on the same pad. So it would become. It's a random solution. It probably wouldn't solve the problem. Ensure that if you had two candidates, 50% would go to the first candidate, 50% to the other candidate, and then you've got the problem if you stand in three, one of them's always going to be in the middle.
Sorry, I was going to say, I suppose it's a bit, there is a bit of supposition here because all of those statistics suggest that the alphabet ruled over the outcome. The actual findings from the Ipsos Mori research didn't actually specifically back that up. Yeah. The findings from the sample tested were that the order didn't really make any difference. It didn't take them longer to find their candidate, and they didn't find it more difficult. The one area where there was concern expressed was from groups representing people with disabilities who might find the randomisation or switching around might make it more difficult for people with additional needs to find where they want to go in terms of the ballot paper.
I can understand that question and understand how that could come about. But I think the bit that's missing here is understanding what people actually go to do nowadays. There was a time, in my time, when they would chalk on the ground, big, huge signs, the name of the candidate because it was against the law to print the party. Yes. Now we print the party, so people go now, in my view, and they look for the party. So if the party was alphabetical, would seem to me, I wonder if you agree, that would sound sensible. But this is about fairness. Yeah. It's about someone always presenting who happened, and we should be fair to everyone, not only to the public, but to the people who stand, in my view, and I wonder if you agree with that too, that some form of fairness in the system should be there. It's part of democracy that it should always be fair. And with the evidence that you've produced, the one bit I don't agree with you, that statistically you've just presented evidence that tells us that alphabetical order is unfair on some individuals. That's what I'm getting from this. I already had that opinion, may I add, so I maybe reinforce my own opinion.
I don't think we are drawing that conclusion. I think what Andy said, it is a complex equation, and actually I think it's fair to summarise our position is, which Andy said at the beginning, is you don't rush at this. There are potential unintended consequences. I think is what you're saying on fairness and even playing field. If one's going to change the system, one's got to really think carefully about it. And it's absolutely right. If research says one thing, since we've had the party names and now logos as well and emblems on ballot papers, that has a great weight with voters. That's where their eyes go first, and then the other factors may come into that. You may have a particularly well-known candidate. So it is a complex equation, as Andy says, and I think we are saying if there's to be change, further research, further pilots, probably further thought is needed.
One thing the research does find, that when we asked specific voters to find candidates, they could find them in the status quo ballot paper, A to Z or Z to A, or by lot. So you could find them if you were choosing to find them. And our primary concern was to ensure that it didn't confuse, any of the options which we were asked to test didn't confuse the electorate.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right, no problem at all, Gil. Can we just have two very short contributions, one from Martin, one from Neil, please?
Yeah, just following up on that, I'm just wondering if the list order effect is stronger where you've got two candidates that are from the same party that are very close to each other on the ballot paper. I mean, I know one council election where there were two SNP candidates who both had surname beginning with H. So if you were looking for SNP, you'd go to SNP and you'd probably just go 1-2. So it did potentially disadvantage one of the candidates. But I'm not sure if your evidence has really looked at that, because if people are going to party and they find two candidates in the party slot, then surely that's more of a pronounced list effect. But I don't know if there's evidence on that or not, if that's just
There is evidence in the sense that we did trialling with the glasses which allow them to see where people or their eyes are going, essentially. And if most of them start at the top, they go down, they find the logo, they go in, find the name, and they tend to vote preference 1 for the first one. So,
right. So
yeah.
Once you found the logo, then you start putting your numbers
But
down.
we don't know. I mean, there may be other motivations.
Yeah. Okay.
H1 was better than H2. You just don't know.
Could have been that.
Neil?
Yeah, so the A to Z, Z to A doesn't make any impact because person in the middle stays the same no matter what, don't they?
If you had 3.
Right, so that we can rule that one out. That doesn't make any sense. The research was inconclusive, but the qualitative research is inconclusive, but the quantitative research or evidence seems pretty conclusive if we've got 75%. And the final point I would ask is, if any of the three were standing for election, would you prefer your name to be Aardvark or Zebedee?
I think I would say it would depend if there were other Zebedees after me.
Exactly.
But I think we would say with the key takeaway from the research is the two options we were asked to look at, Lot and A to Z, Z to A, voters could find the ballot paper. Find the candidate on the ballot paper.
I mean, I'm
but
not
that was our primary motivation to ensure that we didn't come up with, there wasn't a system put in place which disadvantaged voters. If you wanted to find a voter, if you wanted to find a candidate, you could find that candidate.
I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that you could find the candidate. It's the impact of the list order effect that I think we've got to look at, and I think we need to look further into this myself.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Neil. Thank you very much for that, because that is quite complex and it was useful to actually hear your views. Could we move on to electronic voting? Tom Mason, please. Thank you.
Yes, welcome. You've been doing some evaluation of electronic voting over some recent years. What's your evaluation of this? What's your outcome from those evaluations?
So, do you want to see what you want? No, yeah, okay. So electronic voting, which at one level is very attractive because we move in more and more to digital age, and I think it's recognised that it is one of the means of voting that will emerge increasingly. As an organisation, though, we are still saying words of caution about electronic voting, and when one looks around the world, other examples, other comparable democracies, that's probably the right thing to say. We would suggest electronic voting has the great disadvantage compared to our current system is it is not transparent. Our current system is great. You can see the votes, you can see what's happening. Electronic voting, by definition, means your vote goes into a box somewhere and results come out the other end. And there remains real issues about confidence and legitimacy, whether the systems are safe and giving the right results. And it's a big disadvantage on the paper system. Having said that, it is a means of voting that provides another means of accessibility of voting and other alternative voters. And when one looks at other countries around the world who are experimenting with it, and people talk about, there's some experiments in Australia, for example, which is quite interesting, but Estonia is an interesting one in Europe. Small country, everyone has identity cards, it's all very, very digitally linked people. They brought in electronic voting as the means of voting, thinking people would choose that. In fact, experience has shown that each election they have, increasingly voters have gone back to traditional mode. So they have a number of choices, but it does show that confidence of people is not that high in electronic voting still across the world. We're saying words of caution about electronic voting, but we are saying clearly it is, potentially there are advantages to it, and it will come in time. Now we did some pilots a number of years ago, but I don't know if you want to comment on those, the pilots.
I mean, There were a number of pilots in England in the early noughties, 2007, and we carried out the independent evaluations. The bill currently doesn't ask us to independently evaluate any trials which would be undertaken, and we would like to do that. Given we're the Independent Electoral Commission, we can offer expertise. Obviously, in this area, we've done it before. We did undertake for Scottish Government some postal vote pilot testing evaluation around about 2003 through to 5, but we didn't, in a legal sense, exist in council elections in Scotland until 2011. So we're wondering if that's why there is no provision to allow us to evaluate the electronic trials when and if they come.
You've also been events in trying to improve accessibility of to elections. What do you consider is the balance between increased accessibility and the methods of voting taking place at the moment?
So there's accessibility in the sense of giving the voters choices of different ways how to vote. Yes. So again, if one steps back and look at comparable democracies around the world, there are different systems. In the UK, we place a great weight on postal voting as an alternative as of right, which has its advantages and disadvantages. You will see in other democracies other forms of advanced voting. You'll see polling stations open in advance of traditional polling day in various centres as one means of that. You'll see that for their overseas voters in a number of democracies, they'll allow their people to vote in local consulates and embassies. We don't do that for overseas voters. We rely on postal voting. So there are different means which you can enable people to vote. So online voting is, in the sense of over the internet, is people talk about that, or indeed having, when I'm talking about electronic voting, you might have electronic voting machines in polling stations, as it were. That's just a different means of actually casting your vote. It's not really exactly in a sense of greater accessibility. So I think it's the online voting one that is still, I don't think you will find anywhere in the world where there is absolute confidence that that's the way to go. But we are beginning to see examples of that being explored, and that's probably right, but with great caution. I think it's more interesting to think about whether it would be possible in the UK to give people the ability to vote more easily. So we have 381 separate electoral registers across the whole of the UK. You have separate electoral registers in Scotland. In Wales, currently, they're proposing to join up those registers and look at automated registration. If you could join up electoral registers across the UK, or indeed in the nations of UK, you then open up all sorts of possibilities. Wouldn't it be good if I was one end of the country, not near my home on polling day, but I could go into any polling station, for example, and vote? There are examples of that. Wouldn't it be good if I joined up electoral registers, I could register virtually on polling day, maybe on polling day, and vote? Canada's an interesting example of that, because they've joined up electoral registers. So I think one of the key things to accessibility is modernising electoral registers across the UK, joining them up, use of data, and if one achieves that, then that does really begin to open up options for accessibility for people.
Thank you.
I think it's also the case in this increasingly digital age that as we try to encourage young people both to register and to participate, they certainly have grown up with digitisation being a much more common thing. And so it's, in terms of accessibility, for the attractiveness of people to engage with democracy, and also for those who can't reach polling places, it's another option. So at this stage of the 21st century, it's probably something that should be considered as a longer term option. But as Bob said earlier, the key test is for people to have faith that the system is safe and secure and can be trusted and has integrity to it. Now, for me, I think that's one of the things that would be one of the greater concerns that people would express.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And Gil Patterson, please.
The maximum fine in regards to a breach of election spending currently is at £20,000. And we heard from academic experts last week who agree with the Commission that the maximum should be raised to £500,000, £500,000. And I wonder what impact that you believe that may actually have on people who underdeclare.
Yeah, so So for aspects of our electoral law, for certain aspects of potentially breaking electoral law, there is a range of criminal offences. If someone does something that it should be looked at the criminal courts, it's serious enough to. But equally, for some of them, there is a civil fines regime for some of the offences, and we have the ability around political party offences and certain campaigners to issue fines. And currently, the maximum is £20,000, as said. Now that system's been in place since 2010. In practice, the way that's worked is quite rightly, most of our fines are at the lower end. I think they'll always be at the lower end, where maybe a campaign, a party gets something slightly wrong, and that needs to be pointed out. Many times we don't fine at all, we just point it out, but sometimes we apply a low fine, a few £100, a few £1,000. I don't think that will ever change. I think that's right, because one doesn't want to discourage campaigning and participation, and it's obviously, it's often not deliberate, they've just not got the rules right, and they should have got it right. But at the other end of the scale, there is a lot of money in politics, a lot of money in campaigning, many millions of pounds, and it has to be recognised that the prize of elections and winning and being elected it can be tempting. And we have a lot of organisations now, and I'm not really talking about the main parties now, who there's a great culture of compliance with the rules, I think, in the UK. I'm talking about other campaigners who come into elections, other organisations who want to influence how people vote. There's a lot of money involved in campaigning, and we have seen instances where the rules have been broken. And the question is, and it's a question for you as parliamentarians, is a £20,000 in that context sufficient? We think, as the regulator, it isn't. We think you need to have you could pitch it £500,000, you could pitch it whatever you think is appropriate, a higher level fine, but where it is appropriate, sits there as a deterrent, so people hopefully are less tempted to break the rules, but if they do break the rules, it is a sanction that means something. So that's the context why we say it. Do you want anything to say?
Yeah, I think the key point is for it to be a major deterrent to people to break the rules in a major way. And as Bob said, most of the fines currently are at the lower end, and the deterrent would hopefully help people stick within the rules, learn the rules. But we think that the maximum fine is at risk of being seen as the cost of doing business. For big organisations that can afford to pay it, and therefore it isn't a deterrent, whereas the larger maximum fine would be. And were this to be the case through this piece of legislation, Scotland would be leading the UK in terms of setting the bar here, and that might not be unhelpful.
And can Tom just jump in and on the back of that? And come
just a quick question. Can parties insure against being fined? Do you know? Insure, yes.
I want to say I don't think so, but I don't know that for sure.
Would it in fact be legal?
You can insure against sort of legal costs and so forth. I don't think you can insure against a fine in any walk of life, actually. I think I'm right in saying that. I think it's interesting to think also about regulation, just take it out of politics and think about, because this is regulation of the political rules, think about regulation rules in other fields. And we have in the UK seen a trend over the last sort of 10, 20 years of enabling regulators to have a level of fine that matters. And the really sort of topical one we're all aware of is our data, personal data these days, isn't it? It's interesting to see how the Information Commission of Scotland and across the UK has been given by parliaments the power to impose fines that mean something. But most fines are at the lower end still, but where it matters. So there is something, I think it's interesting about talking about leading the way and confidence in elections. It does seem to beg a question about a low fine on politicians does seem, but one doesn't want to discourage campaigning, of course.
And back to Gil Patterson.
Yeah, and your opinion on this is, are you aiming at election agents or are you aiming at parties in this regard for this fine?
It would really be aimed at anybody who broke the law,
Anyway.
whoever they were.
I mean, our absolute priority as a regulator is to get compliance. That's why I alluded earlier to one of the good things in the UK about our politics is, I know we have issues, but we do have a culture of compliance with the rules. You compare it to some other countries in the world. We have really robust, good elections, and the political finance rules are broadly complied with, and the political parties work really hard at that. And we work hard with all campaigners to help them to comply with the rules. And that includes agents. I think agents is a really interesting example, how agents have been sort of a bit caught in the middle between the local candidate rules and the national campaigning and the HQs and the national campaigning rules. I think if there is, I have quite empathy with the position of agents. I think if there's one thing that we could all work at is helping agents do their job better and to be more empowered in the system, so that in their local area, they actually can control things and their word means something. So I think that's an area that actually could be strengthened.
Yeah, so that leads me to my next question, that at the present time there's a financial loss, and I think we can all agree that some of the fines that have been offered up for some heavy spending, it's like chip money. It's like buying a bag of chips in comparison. So $500,000 is meaningful, but I wonder if you've thought or had any evidence in regards to if the game would change, if there would be criminal action in regards to declarations that are sought to deceive, rather than, we all know everybody's human and you make mistakes and you can spot them, but when parties or individuals set out to deceive, should it go to a different area of law?
I mean, there are criminal offences that sit there in addition. If there's a problem with our criminal electoral offences in the UK, it's that most of them were written 100 years ago. And when one talks to prosecuting bodies here in Scotland and the rest of the country and talks to the police and the judges in the courts, there's a real difficulty. Electoral offences are written in rather old language and in a sense they do need to be modernised. This was one of the things that the law commissions across the UK picked up in their report, to take all the electoral law offences and put them in modern criminal law language so they could actually be more readily prosecuted when people breach the law. And I think there is a current gap there where whatever we do about a civil sanction fine, however high we set it, where something is serious enough should be dealt with the criminal courts, which will sit there in addition. If we have, and we do have we have dated electoral laws, it is quite difficult sometimes for prosecutors and police to bring prosecutions because it just doesn't quite work in the modern language. The courts struggle with it. So there is a real need to modernise our criminal law. And again, I commend the package that's written by the UK Law Commissions, has the support of leading criminal lawyers and judges across the country. Those laws could very easily be modernised. It needs the time, the will of Parliament to do that. And for your Scottish elections, that may be a next phase for you to look at that.
And I take it because of the recommendations that you're making, that you see there is actually a problem currently.
Yes.
I do. Okay, thanks very much.
Oh, thank you for that, and thanks for the answers also. Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, panel. In order to get to a system where you have a fine, whatever the size of it, you have to prove that there has been non-compliance. So do you think that you have sufficient power to gather the information if you suspect there's an issue with compliance? And if not, what's the impact of this? I mean, if political parties suspect that another party is overspending because, it's a council election and you've seen 5 different leaflets, can you in real time start an investigation, or do complainants wait till after the election? And is there not an issue that you need to be able to start investigations in real time before leaflets are shredded or whatever?
As you'd expect us to, we work very hard in real time during elections and up to election. We work very hard to respond where there are concerns and complaints, and to avoid the law being broken. If it is broken, bring a person back in regulatory line. But there are 2 problems we hit with that, and we're not complaining because we've given a good toolbox of investigatory powers as a body. But in practice, over the last 10 years or so, there's 2 problems that emerge from how we can regulate. And other regulators are better placed than us on this. One is our ability, and you've alluded to this, to get information quickly in real time and particularly from others involved, other organisations, whether it's social media companies or others are involved, or suppliers and providers. Maybe not the actual organisation itself who are concerned, or the individuals doing the campaign, but those who have been involved in that process. Or for example, it could be, at a very low level, it could be we have the power to put information from a newspaper who placed an advert without an imprint in it, without details. So we have a real problem in real time, quickly to get hold of information from others, which is why we have recommended, and it would be good if this bill actually sort of expanded the power for us to get information from third parties, if I can call it that way, quickly in real time. That would enable us to respond more quickly and investigate. So there is a gap there. The other gap is, which I alluded to earlier, is financial spend information. The way we set up in the UK traditionally doesn't have to be reported to us till well after the electoral event, the big spend many months after, and that means there is a natural period built in where it's you often get investigations that are actually effectively opened 9-12 months after the event has taken place, and that doesn't really help confidence in the system. So we do think in a digital age that we understand why traditionally that was the situation. That made perfect sense. We do think in a digital age now, certainly for the main campaigners, maybe not so much the smaller campaigns, the main campaigners, it should be possible. They're all doing all this on computer systems all the time. The information is there. It should be possible for that information to be available for the public. There'd be transparency much more quickly. Now, how much you shorten those periods, how much you brought it back during the elections is a matter of choice. And that will give the public confidence. It will give us the ability to act more swiftly.
Okay, a couple of things arising from that. Maybe for the benefit of the official report, you could explain to us which other regulators you share information with, and whether there's a problem about sharing that information. And could you explain a bit more how you think that the whole process could be speeded up in terms of getting the information that you need in relation to where there's been suspected breach of the rules?
So I think a good example is the use of personal data, because that is actually sort of a direct issue in politics and campaigning. It's very topical, isn't it? So if I just took that as an example, where there is another regulator, the Information Commission, Information Office across the UK, so we don't have the power currently to share data, in that context. That's slightly odd. We're gathering information. The Information Commission is gathering information. They've actually got the power to share data. We don't. That's very strange. That presents a slight barrier when we're sharing information. We think of how we work with law enforcement agencies, police authorities across the UK and in Scotland. They often want information from us quickly. We currently go through a process. We make it work, but there's sort of data protection rules to follow before we can provide information to them. So that is clumsy. So an information sharing power, which you'll see in a number of different regulators in different fields, is a very standard thing you see in legislation these days. So if you're a regulator, you're gathering things, and actually something occurs to you, it'd actually be useful for another regulator to have it. It makes sense. It's a very easy thing to share data. That would make the system more efficient. In terms of getting information more quickly, I think it is the two things. I think it's giving us the extra power to acquire information from others in real time. So that needs to have a sufficient deterrent to it, so people just can't say, no, I won't. We need to have the ability to acquire the information, get it, if necessary, go to court immediately and require it, get it, and from others. And then there's this wider issue, as I allude to, which is how quickly is it right to make transparent the data that major campaigners, major political parties have on how they're spending their money, not just the money, but the nature of the spending as well. The data exists, they have it, they know they're doing it. Equally, one doesn't want to cut across perhaps the nuances of a particular campaign, how they're campaigning, but actually the core data itself could be made available virtually immediately. Now, it could be made available virtually immediately rather than transparency later, in the sense to the regulator needs it, or it could just be made available to all of us immediately, to all citizens and public. One can have a very much more transparent system if one wants to. The more transparent one makes it, the more quickly, the more confident we would all be that actually that our politics is clean and good. And often there are things we hear about and suspicion, and there's nothing to it. In fact, the campaign is not breaking the law, but because nothing is transparent, that can't be demonstrated. So that, there is benefits on actually giving confidence, I think.
I think you make a good point at the end there, because I wouldn't say that there's an awful lot of confidence in the Electoral Commission if you report what you think is clearly a breach. So I suppose my question would be, if there are 2 or 3 things that you as a body could have power to do that you don't have now to get that confidence in the system, what would it be, and are they covered in this bill?
So So we've spoken about the fine as a deterrent and its the ability to take action. Everyone pitches that. We're talking about the ability to obtain and share information, strengthening our powers there. We've not focused on digital campaigning. Yeah. I think we should, because so much of campaigning now is done online and digitally, and increasingly so. And we have no rules really, no proper rules directed to that nature of campaigning. I mean, it seems an absurdity that actually you can campaign online. You know, if you get a leaflet through the door, it has to say or put it in the newspaper. You have to say who it's from, and who's campaigning, so the voter knows who's trying to influence them. And yet online, we don't have the equivalent rules. Now, in your referendum bill going through in Scotland, you've just introduced those controls for online. I think they're being introduced. You did have it for your 2014 referendum. You had the first. So actually, you would probably, I would suggest you would want it for all your Scottish elections. You know, you would want to have, at the very least, the sources of campaigning online being transparent. But equally, you don't also, the other part of that is on online campaigning. I think it needs some regulation on top of that as well. We need some powers to regulate online campaigning. Otherwise, you'll get different platforms doing things differently. One platform might ban any political campaigning. Is that a good or a bad thing? Another one might allow it in a certain way or a different way. You will get different approaches from what are private companies with different motivations, the online platforms. So you probably want some regulatory rules on top of that. I think you do. So I think those will be our core asks, unless I've missed anything.
I also support, obviously, the Law Commission's recommendations and see what consolidation can be made of those into Scottish electoral law to strengthen the position here. And obviously the timetabling of the changes to allow them to come in as effectively and swiftly as possible.
Okay, thank you.
And can we just have a wee round up on that, please? Thanks.
Let's take quite an extreme mythical example of, say, a party pretending that its social media press account was, let's say, a fact-checking organisation. I know this would never happen in elections in this country, but would that be something that you would see your organisation potentially having a role in, given that was online?
We've always said that, I mean, we are a financial regulator. We regulate the money in politics. And we've always said we would not want to be a truth commission. I don't think it would be a good idea for anyone to be a truth commission in the UK. I think campaigning is about political parties will say what they say. They will campaign to voters. It's about voters understanding who's campaigning towards them, which actually goes to transparency, who's campaigning towards them, and can make their minds up about that. I mean, we have issued a statement yesterday about what you're talking about, and we have been critical and said that all campaigners must campaign with integrity and transparency. So we have been critical of that instance.
But you were mentioning earlier that you think you should have some powers behind you in terms of online enforcement, if you like,
yeah.
or fines or whatever. Would that be an example of an area where you see that where you would want enhanced powers?
I think it's an area, it's a stage again, which is where if you get misleading campaigning online, the first thing is to be, the rules should make it the voter should know who's campaigning at them. That's the first and most important thing. Then there's a question about is it right if something's misleading that it should remain online? And I think you then get into the wider areas of online harms. I wouldn't just focus it down on politics. I think you can think about online, the whole issues of online harm, how online it's used, and that's a much wider regulated debate than for us as an organisation. And I know the UK government, a number of democracies, so Scottish government, are thinking about all those wider issues about online harms in other areas as well. So I think there is a regulatory position to emerge, and I'm sure it will emerge for you as a nation and for the UK as a whole, about all online harms, one of which is what do you do about the aspect of it, which is the political aspect of it. And
sorry to press you on this, but I think it's important. What I'm asking is, I understand exactly what you're saying, but would you foresee that being a role that your organisation may play in the future?
I don't think it's currently immediately obvious that we would do that. If you think, as we stand at the moment, that would be quite a change. We are a we are a financial regulator. You know, it would be quite. Now that's that would be a matter ultimately for Parliament, what it did with its electoral commission, but it would be a change.
Who would likely play that role then? Would that be Ofcom or I don't know?
Well, I think you're right. There are choices. There are choices about how one approaches that in the UK.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, you might not want to be the truth, but you wouldn't want to be the conciliation commission either, actually, so just to mix a couple of words in. I'd like to thank you very much indeed, actually, because I think that was extremely helpful. If there is anything at all, such as digital imprints, etc., which hasn't really been covered here, that you might want to send us on, we'd be very grateful to receive that. And I'd like to thank Dame Sue Bruce, Bob Posner and Andy O'Neill for your attendance today. Thank you very much. Yep. So we're going to be moving to the second panel in just a moment or so. It's a limited amount of time. If you need to go, do you need to go somewhere? All right. We'll need to let's just suspend for a very short period until we get the new panel established. Thank you. And thank you very much then. So it's quite tight on time today, unfortunately. So just to my colleagues on the committee, if you've got a question, try and get it in there. And hopefully we'll be running fine. This is agenda item 2 on the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. Now, joining us on the second panel here today is Isabel Drummond-Murray, Ailsa Henderson and Ronnie Hines, all from the Local Government Boundary Commission for Scotland. I'd like to welcome you here. Now, as I say, we're a wee bit tight for time, so rather than an introductory statement, if we could just move to the questions and you can expand on those as you go, if that's okay. So, Neil Finlay, please. Thank you.
Yeah, my understanding is that there's a proposal to change the name of the organisation, but also, could you maybe just initially explain kind of who does what? Are we creating a new organisation, new separate organisation? Is it going to be 2 organisations? Is it going to be 1? What's the lie of the land?
Okay, so we have recently acquired responsibility for doing boundary reviews of the Scottish Parliament as well as local government. So local government has been the focus of our work since the organisation was founded. So we recently acquired responsibility for the Scottish Parliament from the national body that previously did that, along with Westminster. In terms of how we're set up, we are an independent commission, so Ailsa and I are both members of the commission. We're supported by a secretariat, which Isabel leads. That secretariat supports both us as a commission and the UK Boundary Commission, so they are responsible for the UK, the reviews of the UK parliamentary constituencies. So the commission has a shared secretariat between ourselves and another commission.
Okay, that's fine. So, because what I was obviously concerned was the duplication of and why we would have 2 organisations, but effectively you've got the one organisation, but kind of 2 different headed papers.
Well,
Is that kind of administratively how it works?
I think
it's
it's
two separate commissions, the UK
yeah.
but one team of civil servants
One team
supporting
who
both
cover it.
commissions.
Okay, and you know, we see obviously name changes to organisations hitting the headlines occasionally because you know we have to change this, that, and the next thing. Is that going to be a minor issue for yourselves, or is it is there a big administrative change required?
No, we don't see it as a major issue. I think our submission says we're open to suggestions as to an alternative, so suggestions on a postcard, I suppose, but Boundaries Scotland is a more succinct summary of what we do, and it does have to change because we're no longer just responsible for local government, so our current title really can't be sustained, but something other than Boundaries Scotland that captured what we do would be no difficulty to us.
Yeah, and you're quite happy with that being the name of the new organisation?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Very much, Neil. Thank you for that question. Oh, sorry. Yes, Maureen.
On that, please, convener. So you said you now have control of Scottish Government elections, which has been devolved to you from the UK Electoral Commission. How much scope does that give you to change things? So, or are you still kind of bound by the same rules as the UK Commission? So, for example, could you alter the size of constituencies to take in geographical considerations or island considerations or things like that?
And the legislation governing the reviews hasn't changed at all. It's just the responsibility passed for the Local Government Commission to take on what was previously done by the Reserve Commission.
Okay.
Well, thank you for that. But we're moving back to Maureen Watt, please.
Yeah. So, I want to focus on the length of terms. There is a proposal in the bill to move to fixed 5-year terms. Will that have an impact on your review schedule, or if the terms, I mean, combining both my questions, so, but if it was to remain unaltered at 4 years, does that have an effect as well? So what effect would the boundary term, I suppose, have on your work?
There's maybe two parts to that for us, and I'll try and answer the first part and ask Isabel to answer the second. The first part for me would be the question of whether we as a commission have a view between 4 and 5 year terms, and strictly speaking we don't. We're neutral. We'll work to whatever terms are determined by the Parliament. The one qualification, if you like, I might add to that is that you'll see from our submission that the nature of the work that we do takes quite a bit of time to do it properly. So in our last set of reviews, it took roughly 3 years, just under 3 years from start to finish, to go through the process and produce a report with recommendations and proposals for revised boundaries. So given that, you would expect that 5 years gives us just a bit more headroom for that work as compared to 4. So in administrative terms, we could see that 5 years might make our work a little easier, but we're not saying that's a paramount consideration. We could work on either, and we have done in the past. The second part of it, I think, refers to the practicalities, perhaps, of what the bill proposes in relation to how you might move towards, say, a 5 year term. And I think Isabel can talk a wee bit about how that would affect the way that we'd like to be able to do our work.
Yeah, and I think at the minute the bill proposes a 2028 deadline, which is 12 years after we submitted the 5th reviews in 2016. But whether you move to a 5 year term or stay at 4, that 28 deadline doesn't fit any longer. We're keen to maintain the idea that our proposals can be in place for up to 3 elections. So if you move to 5 year terms, we look to a 15-year deadline. Wouldn't be a target, it would be a deadline. We could review earlier. And if you retain 4 year terms, move to a 12-year. But because of the current 5 year term, that's slightly out of sync, so it would need a minor adjustment from the 28 date that's proposed in the bill.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Maureen. And Tom Mason, please.
Yes, can we focus on the numbers of councillors in multi-wards, whatever? Do you, in fact, need this increased flexibility to increase in numbers up to 5 and possibly down to 2? Do you actually need that? And I notice you've got a fairly good consent as to that's a good idea in terms of the survey, although the survey seemed to be quite small. if I remember, 118 or something, people. And also the impact of changing the numbers of people in a ward to the proportionality that takes place. Have your comments on that?
Yeah, I think our position is that we welcome the additional flexibility. It makes the key part of our work, which is designing wards that are fit for purpose in terms of the legislation that we work to, it makes that a little easier. We could point to examples from the last set of reviews that we did for councils, where if we'd had the power, we might have suggested a 5-member ward in an area or two, and likewise we might have come up with a 2-member ward. And you have to remember that's in the context of operating in legislation that simply gave us 3 and 4, so we weren't looking to have 5-member wards, we weren't looking to have 2, but notwithstanding that, we could find occasions when it might have been a good thing to do. So conceivably, given that we, under the terms of this legislation, would have a choice between 2, 3, 4 and 5, we might find more instances where 5 or 2 would work. So we welcome the additional flexibility, but in terms of the specifics of the question, to say that we need it, I couldn't say that we need it because the legislation as it stands with 3 and 4 has been perfectly satisfactory for the work that we've done, but I think it would improve our ability to design wards that local people recognised and wanted to be part of if we had other options as well.
Can I just jump in? I mean, clearly there were concerns about community ties being broken last time round, and we know that communities in Scotland come in different shapes and sizes, and so the extra flexibility of having 2-member wards and 5-member wards would allow us to capture wards that better capture entire communities within them, because at the moment it is sometimes difficult to use the 3 and the 4-member wards to do that. And when the Minister didn't accept some of our recommendations, the point that was made was about the ability of the wards to reflect community ties and community boundaries. So that extra flexibility would be helpful to us. It also recognises not just that the communities are different shapes and sizes, but there are considerable variations in terms of how rural or urban those wards are. And so having variation that runs from 2 to 5 also allows us to better tailor those wards, because if you're stuck with larger ward sizes, and you have very low population density, you have rural and remote communities, you have island communities, it's very hard to identify wards that are a manageable size. And we're working within the definition of effective and convenient local government, and that's not really defined much more than that, but we are thinking in terms of how voters access their councillors, but also how councillors undertake their work. And identifying very, very large wards does make that more problematic.
Yes, I mean, my next worry is the operation of multi-purpose, council wards anyway, because as you get bigger and bigger, greater numbers of councillors, it gets more undefined as to who's responsible for what. And I just wonder if there's any survey being done on the acceptance of the multi-council wards in terms of the way they work, because your focus is on getting, if you like, the boundaries, fixing the communities and things, not really taking into account whether people like the idea or not. I mean, there are alternative voting systems which could be put into place. And I'm not advocating first past the post necessarily, but I must admit personally, as a city councillor myself, the operation of multi-council wards is problematical in a number of ways.
Well, we take absolutely no view on the electoral system. We very much work within the rules that we are given. And so if the electoral system is STV, then we design the wards as best we can for STV. On your point about whether there is useful research on the ground, no, and this is something that we've discussed before in terms of how beneficial a body of work that looked at how voters interact with the electoral system and interact with their councillors, how councillor workload is affected by things like district size. No, to date there is not a great wealth of academic research on this. There has not been commissioned research from practitioners on this. And Ronnie,
just to add to that, I think the question is well posed. So from our point of view, while we welcome the additional flexibility, as I said previously, I think we have to recognise that it's quite a significant step to move from a multi-member ward system, which currently offers only 3 or 4 member wards as the choice, to one which basically doubles that. It says you could have 2, 3, 4 or 5. And in addition to that, it's worth bearing in mind that under the Islands Act, we can actually have single member wards in 6 of the councils, and we're currently working with those 6 councils on that basis. So very quickly, we could be reaching a situation where we have significantly expanded what we mean by the multi-member ward system. And I think what I take to be the point of the question is that that is being done without the benefit of any strong data or research that tells us how the current system has operated since it was implemented. So I'm not saying that that is a reason to be fearful of the provisions in the bill, but I do think it's on the occasion to ask the question, how much should we know about how multi-member wards work in practice? And we think as a commission it would be no bad thing for some such research to be carried out.
Thank you.
And just a wee back up on that from Jamie.
Yeah, it was along the same lines as that. We talked about community. I mean, I'm from Orkney, so I'm one of the areas which I think the Islands Act, well, I know the Islands Act obviously covers in regards to kind of multi and single member wards. Communities can sometimes be split up in terms of their representation, but also they can stay together, but they can be lumped in with others. So the community can stay the same, but they're lumped in with other areas, and therefore the councillors can change if there's a boundary change in which group that they're lumped in with. The boundary changes, and therefore the individual councillors might change over every election. How do you balance that? You know, the voters like to know who their local councillor is. They may want to stay part of a group that has a familiar group of councillors. How do you balance that that side of it?
Yeah, well, others will contribute as well, but my short answer would be with a degree of difficulty, which is one of the reasons why we do welcome the additional flexibility proposed in the bill. So essentially, in those terms, what we need to do is to seek some appropriate balance between, on the one hand, the paramount consideration in the founding legislation, which is parity, which means that more or less within a given council area, each elector's vote counts for the same as every other elector. So there's no massive disparity within a council area in terms of the ratio between those who are represented and those who are elected to represent them. So that is a paramount consideration. But we also have to recognise the importance of local ties, as the legislation puts it, but community more widely, as your question is putting it. So we do seek to do that. The additional flexibility helps with it, but it doesn't change the fundamental proposition, which is that we have to manage to do that. The other thing that's inherent in this bill, which I think is helpful in that regard, is that subject to 1 or 2 amendments that we would like to see, it gives us the opportunity to engage more fully with both the local council and the communities that make up the area of the council, so that we get more time to actually have a dialogue with people about what it means to be a member of a community, because it's in the eye of the beholder. But we can try to understand what people feel strongly about and how then we can best take account of that when we're trying to design ward boundaries around the legislative framework. So I think the idea of having rolling reviews and time to be doing a smaller number of councils than all 32 at once is an important component of the legislation, and that as well would help us in striking an appropriate balance between parity on the one hand and community identity on the other, but others may want to come in as well.
Can I just say, so is that engaging with community councils particularly?
Well, we're seeking to do that right now in the 6 councils that make up the councils that are covered by the Island Act, and recently, in fact, we did that on Shetland. We met with all, most of the chairs of the community councils to hear at first hand what community means to them.
Yeah.
And in keeping with the spirit of an absence of disruption, I think that was the initial principle behind having a 12-year upper limit for the reviews, so that if there's a 4-year electoral term, then that's 3 electoral terms when those boundaries are in place. So that would be another argument for moving that from 12 to 15 if there is a 5-year electoral term use, because it means you're not changing them after every single election. But that would be stability in the ward boundaries, not necessarily stability in the elected councillors, because of course that could change at any election, even if the ward boundaries are the same.
I guess it was just, I mean, I've known councillors. My father was a councillor, and his that was when it was only single wards, but he constantly moved because his boundary, the boundary effectively changed, so he almost got kind of moved across seats to still stay within our community. So it was just that aspect that was of interest. Thanks.
Jamie. You've actually covered something I was going to ask you about rolling reviews, so I think we'll move on to Gil Patterson, please.
Convener, do you have any concerns around proposals to subject certain local government boundary commission changes to enhance parliamentary scrutiny by orders being subject to the affirmative procedure?
No, we don't have concerns about it. Ailsa's already alluded to the process that governed the proposals that emerged from the last set of reviews, where it's subject to ministerial decision. We think that it's appropriate that Parliament should have that role, and we welcome the scrutiny that Parliament would bring to bear on our work. Again, you can see from our submission, though, that we are at pains to stress the independence of the work that we do and the fundamental importance I think that has for the democratic system within which we work. So we would welcome scrutiny from parliamentarians that added value, if you like, to the work that we are seeking to do. So who knows how that will work out in practice, and it's not for the Commission to suggest to the Parliament how to exercise its scrutiny, so we wouldn't do that. But what we would say is that we would expect that if the Parliament is taking an interest in the proposals that we've made for a particular council area, that will emerge partly perhaps because that council or the communities within it have a view about that, and I think that's all fair grist to the mill. But also that we would be, I guess my anticipation would be that there would be specific elements of our proposals that you were coming back to us on, because that would be constructive and helpful to us in following the process that's set out in the bill to do some further reflection and carry out a further review against that. So we would be looking for something quite specific around an area like, I don't know, just pick one at random, say the borders. In this particular part of the borders, we think that that might not be the best possible fit for community interests or whatever, and we can take that away and work with it. So something that helped us move our work on is, I think, what we'd be hoping for from that process. But in overall terms, to answer your question, absolutely no problem with parliamentary scrutiny. I think it's capable of adding value to our work.
Okay, good. Thanks for that.
Well, thank you. That was very helpful there, actually, because you're giving answers to things without them being asked, actually. So that was good. No, thank you very much. That's really useful. And Maureen, please. Thank you.
Sorry, my nose is running. So, in relation to the removal of advertising for the Scottish Parliament boundary changes, are there other advantages in removing the requirement to publish proposals in relation to Scottish parliamentary boundary changes in the local newspaper? Is that just yesterday's communication?
I think the problem with the Scottish Parliament legislation is just it's inflexible. I think the parallel in local government is that we advertise as we see fit. What the legislation requires for Scottish Parliament is that we not only publish notices in at least one newspaper circulating in each constituency, but that notice describes the effect of the change. It's not even enough to have a notice that says go and look at the website. That just means it's very expensive. I think in the first review, my predecessors went down the route of putting maps, and it just cost, I think it was over £500,000 in total. And we just think more flexibility would mean we could choose to do that if there was a particular area we thought it was helpful. But if we equally thought social media or putting the money into other sorts of advertising was more worthwhile, it just gives us that additional ability to do that. So it's not about necessarily saving money, it's about giving us the flexibility to use money that we have in the publicity budget in the best way possible. And there is some evidence, I think, that well, local newspaper circulation is down on where it would have been at the time the legislation was introduced. I don't know, I can definitively say people don't look at public notices in the press. I'm sure some people do, but I think we can use a wider range of publicity measures, which might include public notices in papers.
So have you set out a plan of what sort of communication strategy?
Well, we're not quite yet. I mean, we're trying different things with the Islands reviews. I think Ronnie referred to the benefit of having a small number of councils at one time. You can try things out. So we're breaking new ground for us and using social media, but it's early days. By the time we come on to the next Scottish Parliament review, yes, we would come up with a plan for how best to do it. But we're not quite at that point yet.
We've used a range of different methods in the councils that we're looking at right now, and that's going to allow us to figure out which ones are most effective in terms of the responses that we're getting in. But the new methods have resulted in a doubling of submissions so far. Very early on, a doubling of the submissions. So we think we're onto something in terms of variations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on that? No, right. Can I ask, thank you very much, can I ask if there's anything which isn't in the bill, which we've seen, which you feel is a matter of importance for electoral reform or administration in Scotland? Is there anything you think needs to be pressed that isn't already being proposed?
Colleagues are reflecting, not something that's not in the bill, but I would reiterate the point that was made earlier about the practicalities of achieving the policy intention of the bill as expressed in the policy memorandum. The expression rolling reviews is the one that comes to mind, and I think we would like to see the opportunity to follow the same kind of more engaged process that we are able to follow at the moment with the 6 island councils, expanded to the whole of Scotland. And as matters stand, if we move to 5-year terms and don't change the provisions in the bill for having an upper ceiling of 12 years between reviews, then it's not going to achieve in practice what I think the bill is trying to achieve in theory, and that's quite an important thing for us. So it's not missing from the bill, but it's not stated in a way that we think would achieve the objective. So now that I've filibustered a wee bit, maybe my colleagues...
No, I would agree with that. The adjustment to 15 years so that it takes into account... Well, the adjustment to 15 if 5-year electoral terms are used would be helpful, so that it means that the boundaries are designed for 3 electoral terms would be useful because it minimises disruption, but it also allows us the opportunity to look at a certain number of councils at a time rather than all 32 at the same time, which then means that there's more capacity for consultation, more engagement with community councils, different public city strategies and so on. So it allows us to tailor things and get it right.
So it's practicality, actually. If you do change to a 5-year period, then the rolling programme and to make it actually work would really have to go up to 15 years, wouldn't it?
Yeah, just multiples of electoral terms. So 3 electoral terms. So if it's 4, then 12. If it's 5, then 15.
Aye, right, okay. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you very much. Anyone else? Any further questions? Because what I was going to say is same as in the first panel who came to us today, although you've been very encouraging in terms of the depth that you've given us replies. If there is anything at all that you think we haven't covered today that comes to mind, we'd be very pleased to hear from you, because that's been extremely helpful. So I'd just like to thank Ronnie Hines, Isabel Drummond-Murray and Ailsa Henderson for your attendance today, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll just suspend and move into private session. Allow time, don't rush too much, but we'll allow time to let you go.